Now, without further ado, let's begin our program. Our keynote speaker this morning is Senator Angus King. In January 2013, he was sworn in as Maine's first independent United States Senator. Senator King is proud to join the long line of thoughtful, independent leaders from the state of Maine. Prior to taking office, Senator King served as the 72nd governor of Maine. And during his 2 terms in the Blaine House, he focused on economic development and job creation. Today, Senator King will share via a pre-recorded presentation his insights into one of his heroes, General Joshua Chamberlain. Senator King has taught courses on leadership at Bates and Bowdoin that included teaching about Chamberlain's greatest contributions to Maine. We are honored to have Senator King to be a part of today's program.
Joshua Chamberlain. I love it, whoever it was at Merida that thought of talking about Maine's economy and the future of Maine in the context of Joshua Chamberlain. Joshua Chamberlain, in my opinion, is the greatest citizen Maine ever produced, and one of the smartest people that I've ever encountered in Maine history. His story is fascinating and illuminating and inspiring. He was born in Brewer, Maine, lived on a farm, more or less self-educated up through high school. He decided he wanted to go to college. He wanted to go to Bowdoin College, a little college in Brunswick, Maine. In order to get in those days, you had to have a familiarity with Greek and Latin. So Joshua Chamberlain taught himself Greek and Latin. This is in Brewer, Maine in the 1840s. He memorized a Greek textbook. That's the kind of brain that this guy had. He went to Bowdoin, graduated, was going to become a preacher, and he went back to the Bangor Theological Seminary, finished there, and by the time he finished at the Bangor Seminary and then went back to Bowdoin to teach, he had mastered 10 languages. That's, again, an illustration of how smart he was and the kind of mind that he had, not only for languages, but for many other subjects. He didn't have the calling as a preacher. He had a calling as a teacher, and he went back to Bowdoin and taught, I'm told, every course that they had at the college except for mathematics. So he was a professor at Bowdoin going up through into the late 1850s, 1860, and all of a sudden, a dramatic thing happened in the country. Abraham Lincoln was elected president in November of 1860, and by the time he was inaugurated in March of 1864, that was when Inauguration Day was. It's now in January, but in those days it was in March. 7 states had seceded from the Union, and the country was plunged into civil war. Chamberlain wanted to go, wanted to serve, and he ended up, I'm shortening this story quite a bit, but he ended up joining the Army over the objections of the president and the trustees of Bowdoin College. He joined the Army, became an officer in the 20th Maine Regiment, and of course, as we all know, went on from there to be the hero, one of the great heroes of the Battle of Gettysburg and the Civil War. He was chosen by Grant to accept the surrender of the Southern troops at Appomattox, started the war lower in the ranks, ended up a major general at the end. An amazing guy, wounded several times, given last rites on the battlefield, returned to Maine, went back to the war, and was really one of the great leaders in that awful struggle. Shortly after returning to Maine, he was elected governor for 4 terms, but in those days, a term was only 1 year. So he had to run 4 times. Sounds like a nightmare to me, but he had to run 4 times. He was elected governor of Maine 4 years and then became president of Bowdoin College. Now, he, as I say, as you can obviously tell, he's one of the most well-respected people in Maine. And in 1876, he was invited to deliver a speech about Maine, Maine's place in history, at the 1876 Centennial Exhibition in Philadelphia, essentially a World's Fair. What he wrote was extraordinary, and I urge you to try to find it. If you can find it through Google. It's a combination history, analysis, economic analysis, and it's just an amazing piece of work. The first half of it is really a PhD thesis on the founding of Maine and the formation of Maine, the separation from Massachusetts. But what I want to chat about today is his visionary view of Maine in the future and the development of our economy. And I'm going to do something I don't usually do, which is read provisions. I don't like to read on the air, but I'm going to read you things that Chamberlain wrote in this 1876 speech that really, I think, capture and show how brilliant he was about Maine, and they relate to us today. The first thing he noted, which I thought was really quite funny, is that he talked about Maine's inferiority complex. And I think we're all familiar with this idea of, we're north of Boston and all the important things happen down there and that kind of thing. He said, the obscuration of its more recent career, he's talking about Maine, the absolute and almost abject surrender of its name and history is something singular. Chamberlain went on to say, the minds of its own people seem to acquiesce in its loss of birthright with strange humility. And I found in my experience in Maine, one of the things we have to constantly push is we can do it. If you remember when I became governor, my motto was Maine is on the move. That was a purposeful attempt to sort of raise people's spirits and give us the feeling that, yes, we can compete too. And that's the beginning of success in any enterprise, is believing that you can do it. And I was amazed to read that provision about Maine's strange humility, even in 1876. The next thing that Chamberlain touched on in this speech, which I think should ring a bell with all of us today, is the struggle to hold on to young people. He wrote, these causes, he was talking about the War of 1812, led to that notable rush to the West in 1815 and 1816, known as the Ohio fever. I'd never heard of the Ohio fever before, but apparently that was something in the 1800s by which the state lost 15,000 of her most energetic people. That's a problem that we are still dealing with today. And I'm going to touch on a little bit later about young people, particularly leaving the state. I think what's happening today is a lot of young people leave the state, but they come back. And I think that's a hopeful sign for both for the state and for the country. The next piece I think that he touched on that's so consistent with the Maine that we know is independence. Here's how he described Maine to the people that listened to his speech down in Philadelphia. Maine is conservative, self-reliant, calm, slow even to wrath or novelty. She will lead in a noble cause when convinced, but she is not fanatical, narrow, nor self-seeking. She does by no means always follow Massachusetts, nor even New England. What an insight about our state. It's an insight that I think applies today. Conservative, self-reliant, calm, to slow even to wrath or novelty. The next point that I think was important is how the importance of agriculture, and it's been really interesting in Maine in recent years, agriculture has been one of our bright spots. The average age of farmers has been going down. The activities in our farms have been going up. The value of the crops that are being developed in Maine are going up. And here's what Chamberlain said about that almost 150 years ago. All this is well and betokens advance of civilization, but the balance ought not to be so against agriculture, and farm wages ought not to be so low. In a healthy state of things, diversity of occupations should stimulate the home market. That means buying and selling between us, and advance the value of farm products and farms and the character of farming. By the way, he was a wonderful writer. I should have mentioned he wrote a number of books. His speeches read like literature. Really an extraordinary writer. This is an amazing passage where he really looked into the future, because you have to remember he came of age in Maine in the 1830s, 40s, and 50s at a time when physical labor and wresting a living from the land was really the norm, and it was hard work. He says, But it would seem from these tables, he gives a lot of statistics, that there is a prevailing notion that mind and skill can only be rewarded by trade and manufacturers. And the local demands for skilled labor being supplied, our youth have gone forth to other states where capital invites hands guided by brains, and work and wit give quicker returns. Isn't that fascinating? Our youth have gone forth to other states where capital invites hands guided by brains, and work and wit give quicker returns. In other words, he foresaw the brain economy, if you will, the importance of developing skills at a time when that really wasn't as apparent as it certainly is today. He also was very clear about the danger of simply being a state that extracts its resources. That's a plantation for someplace else. And he touches on this several times. And this is a fairly long passage, but bear with me because I think it's terribly insightful. He said something of this is due to a general, he's talking about people leaving, to a general westward push, which seems to be an instinct of man, and Maine being furthest east of the states is most exposed to this attraction. Everything is west of her. The fact of the matter is that in our way of doing business, Maine has become an old and exhausted state before her true wealth has begun to be developed. Listen to this. We have been stripping off what was easiest to take without mercy and without forethought. We have been acting the part of the barbarian whose highest reach of industry is to send away the raw products of nature, as long as they hold hour and then hunt for new hunting grounds. The nation that relies solely on the sale of her raw products will find that when they are gone, she is gone. That's an amazing insight when you think of Maine at that time. It was mostly raw products, farming, fishing, and forestry. The nation that relies solely on the sale of her raw products will find that when they are gone, she is gone. Until quite recent times, our ways of industrial economy have been perverse and ruinous. And this is one of them. Nowhere in the world of life is robbery blessed. You may indeed dig out the rock and the ore and give nothing back. That will do while it lasts, he says. But true production is reciprocity. Interests balance and support each other. What you borrow, you must repay. This is, he was an environmentalist before there was such a thing. It is right, no doubt, to avail ourselves of the gratuities of nature, but you may be blind and brutish about it. Always you must consider the extent of her stores and her powers of recuperation. I'm just, as you can tell, just astonished by this. Otherwise, you will sap her life and leave her and yourself at the end wretched companions in poverty. Maine is becoming her and murdering her land, shipping away the fertility of her soil and the stuff which should have made material for her own ingenuity and skill, but snatching at the near advantage and heeding not what was to come. What prophetic words for what happened at the end of the 19th century. And I think they're words that we should live by today. It's an argument for stewardship. Which of course Maine from the 1950s on has been synonymous with environmental protection and the concept of stewardship. I touched on this when I first ran for governor in 1994. One of the mottos I had was no fish should leave Maine with its head on. And what I meant, of course, was we should be doing value added here, not sending raw products out of the state just as Chamberlain was talking about. The Wall Street Journal, by the way, characterized that as the most bizarre campaign promise in the history of American politics, but I don't think they really got it. He then also talked about how important skills are. And that goes for us today, to education, to our community colleges, to imparting technical skills. He said, no one could call our people lazy They've been industrious, gay, hard workers, but they've acted as if the only law of labor was hard work. They've been slow to see that true labor seeks not simply where it can find obstacles to overcome, but how it can work most advantageously, where mind can best win mastery over the utilities of nature. Listen to this. Hard labor is a prison sentence. Skilled labor is the enfranchisement of man. Isn't that an amazing distillation? Hard labor is a prison sentence. Skilled labor is the enfranchisement of man. Hard labor keeps man in bondage to nature. Skilled labor makes her his willing and strong servant. Hard labor uses man as a brute only. Skilled labor almost always lifts brute force to human. Again, he's foreseeing the Industrial Revolution, the substitution of brain power for brute force, and really an amazing insight. Okay, let's see. We're getting close now. This is an interesting one, talking about the importance of business and business entities. And this is a bit of Maine history I didn't know. He said, Maine has been slow to learn this lesson. To make matters worse, she has a long time cherished an insane prejudice against corporations. He puts that in quotes, corporations, as if they were despots of society and adversaries of souls. She did not see that this was to fight against capital, the instrument that serves labor. Interesting insight. Against enterprise, the force that moves labor. Against mind, the power that exalts it. Very interesting insight in 1876 about the future of the business community in Maine. He talks about the interest of a balanced economy. Here's one fascinating insight I'd never thought about before. Money flows in the same direction as raw materials. Think about that. Money flows in the same direction as raw materials. That is, from the producing countries toward the great industrial and business centers. In other words, if all you're doing is producing raw materials, the money's going to go out. And we've learned that over the history of Maine. I urge only the more obvious maximum that diversified industries, widely scattered in local centers, which create a near and constant market and secure within this domestic circle all the advantages claimed for reciprocity and free trade, afford the most favorable conditions for a prosperous agriculture. Thus, the factory and the farm should balance. Now, here's a wonderful one that relates to us today. Not many people know, if some of you may be aware that in Aroostook County, there's a Swedish area. There's a town called New Sweden. There's a town called Stockholm. Chamberlain, when he was governor, worked on the economic development of Aroostook County by importing Swedish farmers to till the land and boost that economic system. And here's what he said. Then too are broad, he was talking about farms and fields in the West. He said, there too are broad fields yet to be taken up, for the rich resources of Maine stretch as far inland as the whole sweep of the shore. There are no fairer grain fields in all the western prairies than in the Aroostook Highlands. That little band of Swedes we took pains to plant there return the cost of the enterprise and the example they have set us. A shipload of such men and women is better than a warehouse full of foreign luxuries. Doubtless we shall hear more of their virtues when they have votes to give. Immigration was important in 1876, and it's important now. It's important in bringing new ideas, new energy, new people, new markets into our state. And Chamberlain realized that by bringing the Swedes to Aroostook County. Of course, then and now, education was important. Apparently, Maine scored among the highest in the country in some surveys at this time in the breadth of our education, not necessarily in the results, but in the fact that everybody was getting educated. He says, I'm aware that this does not mean everything. That means the scores. It does not mean that the highest pitch of education is here attained, but that education is broadest spread. Power of public education. Happy has been for her the law that of the day of small things is not to be despised, that the little red schoolhouse may have its part too in the world's affairs, no less than the luxuries of storied halls. He knew then education was the key, and today education is the key. So, infrastructure. He talked about infrastructure. Let me see. I think he talks about infrastructure not in this speech, but in his inaugural addresses as governor. He had 4 of them. He talks about several pieces of infrastructure. He was a visionary about the water power of Maine. There's a wonderful phrase where he talks about the huge amount of energy that's going down our rivers. And he talks about the potential. He was thinking of mechanical water power. Of course, ultimately it became electrical water power, but he viewed that as one of Maine's great assets. And then finally, he talked about the importance of roads, and I mentioned water power. And today, it's still infrastructure, but today it's broadband. If Chamberlain were alive today, I know well that he would be advocating the expansion of broadband throughout our state. That's the key piece of missing infrastructure right now. I believe if we can fill that gap, there's no stopping Maine. One of the big differences between now and then is the mobility of people and the ubiquity of communication. And the fact that for the first time in human history, people can work where they live instead of having to live where they work. You see the difference? They can work where they live. They can live anywhere and they can work. We've learned that during the pandemic. I believe Maine has a huge potential because it's a wonderful place to live. Once we get the infrastructure, particularly the broadband, and if we're sensible enough to maintain our quality of place, which is what brings people here. If you can do your work from anywhere, why not do it from a wonderful place like Maine? So Chamberlain was a brilliant analyst of what was going on in Maine in the 1860s and 70s. He's a brilliant predictor of what's going on in Maine today. Education, infrastructure, diversity of industry, immigration, all of those things come together to create the Maine that we know and the Maine that we, you and I, Marita, me, all of our colleagues, are trying to build for the future of our absolutely wonderful state. Thanks. Enjoy being with you.